Pontiac had planned a ruse. Warriors would enter under peaceful pretense, hiding weapons beneath blankets, and once inside, they would seize the fort. But legend told of a woman inside Detroit. Some said she was native, others said she was the daughter of a British trader, who warned Gladwin of Pontiac's plan. Historians debated her identity, but the effect was undeniable. When Pontiac walked into the Great Hall, expecting relaxed guards, he found British soldiers lined wall to wall, armed and ready, bayonets glinting in the firelight. Pontiac felt the earth shift beneath him. The plan had failed. He withdrew with the composed dignity of a leader unwilling to show alarm. But he did not leave. Instead, he laid siege to the fort, beginning one of the longest and most dramatic sieges in North American history. Inside Detroit, tension became a constant companion. Days blended into nights filled with musket fire, arrows sailing over walls, drums echoing in the distance. The British rationed food, calculated dwindling supplies, and prayed for reinforcements. Outside the walls, Pontiac's warriors cut off all roads and waterways, ensuring no supplies could reach the fort. Months passed, the siege tightened, yet Detroit held. Far to the east, British commander Geoffrey Amherst read the reports with rising anger. Amherst, a man of strict discipline and cold temperament, believed the tribes were merely subjects to be commanded. He dismissed their grievances, mocked their audacity, and wrote letters suggesting brutal strategies to suppress them. His disdain blinded him to the realities on the ground. He underestimated the unity, the determination, the strategy of the tribes. But another threat was rising: smallpox. It began with whispers. A trader's child fell ill. A soldier developed fever and pockmarks. In some frontier villages, entire families grew sick within days. Whether spread accidentally or deliberately in a few isolated incidents has been debated for centuries. As whispers of resistance traveled across the lands, British garrisons found themselves increasingly isolated. Forts that once felt secure now seemed like lonely outposts surrounded by endless forest. Supplies fell low. Traders who once moved freely along the waterways now traveled with armed escorts. The British officers wrote letters to their superiors, demanding more men, more ammunition, more assurances. But the empire believed the war was over and its coffers were already exhausted. Then, like a storm sweeping in from a clear sky, the attacks began. At Fort Sandusky, warriors arrived under the guise of friendly negotiation. Inside the wooden stockade, British soldiers greeted them with the formal stiffness expected of garrison men. They did not see the glances exchanged between the visiting chiefs. They did not sense the tension. They did not notice hands drifting closer to hidden weapons. When the attack erupted, it was swift and merciless. Flames engulfed the buildings. Survivors fled into the woods, but few reached safety. News of the fort's fall spread quickly, and the forest seemed to inhale in anticipation. Soon, Fort St. Joseph, Ouiatenon, Miami, Venango, Le Boeuf, one after another, fell to coordinated assaults by tribal warriors who moved with the precision of those defending their homeland. Each fort's fall sent ripples through the British command. Officers who had once spoken confidently of dominion now whispered among themselves, wondering if the continent was slipping out of their grasp despite their victory. At Fort Detroit, a different storm gathered. Pontiac himself appeared outside its walls in the early days of May, accompanied by several hundred warriors, Ottawa, Ojibwe, Huron, and others whose loyalties he had united. He approached the gate with dignified calm, dressed in traditional attire adorned with feathers and beadwork that carried the history of his people. British Commander Major Henry Gladwin received him warily. The wind that swept over the Ohio Valley in the early months after the Treaty of Paris carried with it a strange silence. It was not the peaceful kind, not the gentle hush of forest life returning to itself. It was the silence of uncertainty, of people adjusting to a world suddenly reordered. British soldiers, hardened by years of marching and brutal winters, looked out from the ramparts of newly claimed forts with cautious eyes. They had won the continent, but they could not yet rest. The French were gone, but in their place rose a tension far older and far more deeply rooted than any European rivalry. Across the Great Lakes and into the vast interior, native nations gathered in council fires that glowed like islands of light in the dark wilderness. Leaders who had watched the war reshape their world now spoke in low, urgent voices. Some tribes had fought alongside the French, others with the British, and many had shifted allegiances out of survival. But with France defeated, their balance of power had disappeared. They faced an empire that no longer needed their friendship, only their land. Pontiac, the influential Ottawa war leader, felt the winds shift before most. He moved through villages along the Detroit River, speaking of broken promises, rising settlers, and the British officers who dismissed tribal diplomacy with cold indifference. Pontiac had watched the French depart, leaving behind trading posts that once buzzed with life and mutual respect. Now British flags fluttered where French fleur-de-lis had flown, and the new empire carried itself with an authority that felt suffocating. He spoke of restoring equilibrium, of resisting a future where their people would be pushed deeper into wilderness until the wilderness itself ended. Warriors listened, mothers listened, elders listened. The decision to fight was not born of hatred but of fear. Fear that their children would inherit a world where they had no place. The British, frightened and stretched thin, issued the Proclamation of 1763, barring settlers from crossing the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists, who felt they had fought and bled for that land, seethed with resentment. The seeds of revolution were quietly sown in the soil of British victory. As the war's last embers faded, Washington returned to Virginia, carrying scars both visible and invisible. He had entered the conflict as a young officer seeking recognition and emerged as a man who understood empire, ambition, and the costs of power. He would remember the rain at Fort Necessity, the smoke of the Monongahela, the silent forests that once seemed endless. And though he did not yet know it, the same forces that shaped him here would one day call him to lead another, far greater struggle. The French and Indian War had ended, but its shadow stretched far into the future. Borders shifted, alliances crumbled, and the British Empire, swollen with victory, would soon face a rebellion born from the very people who had fought beside them in these same forests. The war had redrawn maps, but it had also changed hearts, planting questions of loyalty and identity that would one day ignite into revolution. And in the quiet of the American wilderness, where muskets once burned the air and war cries echoed through the trees, the land waited, knowing history was far from finished. The British Parliament poured money and troops into the conflict, determined not to lose. Under Prime Minister William Pitt, strategy transformed. New generals arrived, men like Amherst and Wolfe, relentless in ambition. British ships blockaded French ports, starving Canada of reinforcements and supplies. The tide began to turn. In 1758, British forces attacked Fort Louisbourg, the gateway to the St. Lawrence River. Cannons roared for weeks, sending thunder rolling across the water. Smoke blanketed the fort until surrender became inevitable. With control of the coast, Britain began pushing deeper into the heart of New France. Fort Duquesne fell next. Its defenders, outnumbered and starving, burned it before retreating. The British rebuilt it as Fort Pitt, planting their flag at the forks of the Ohio River, the very land where Washington's first encounter had taken place years before. But the true blow came in 1759, at the Plains of Abraham. The night before the battle, British troops scaled cliffs under the cover of fog, hauling cannons up impossible slopes. By dawn, they formed ranks outside Quebec. General Montcalm, courageous but outnumbered, led the French in a desperate defense. Musket volleys cracked across the fields. Soldiers fell in rows. Both generals, Wolfe and Montcalm, were mortally wounded, each dying unaware that the battle would decide the future of a continent. With the fall of Quebec and later Montreal, New France collapsed. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 ended the conflict. France ceded vast territories. Britain emerged as the dominant power in North America. Yet victory carried consequences the British had not foreseen. Native nations, betrayed by shifting alliances and threatened by increasing settlement, rose in anger. Pontiac's rebellion erupted across the frontier. British forts fell to coordinated tribal attacks. Supplies dwindled. Soldiers starved in blockades. The rain did not stop as the British left the fort, carrying wounded men through the swampy clearing. Washington looked back only once at the half-collapsed walls, feeling the sting of failure, but also something else. A fire that had begun to burn inside him, one that would one day drive him to lead an entire revolution. Across the Atlantic, the surrender created shockwaves. Britain, humiliated, resolved to reclaim dominance in North America. France, enraged by Jumonville's death, prepared for war. Native nations, long entangled in European promises, found themselves navigating a dangerous game played between empires. In the years that followed, the continent transformed into a battleground of strategy and survival. The French strengthened Fort Duquesne. The British, under General Braddock, marched with the precision of European armies. Bright uniforms, polished muskets, rigid formations. Yet the wilderness was not Europe. It swallowed Braddock's army whole near the Monongahela River. French troops and their native allies struck from behind trees, firing in bursts of smoke and disappearing before British soldiers could form a line. In the chaos, Braddock fell from his horse, mortally wounded. Washington, young and untested, rode through hails of gunfire, rallying terrified men and guiding survivors through the forest. Bullets pierced his coat but spared his body, a fact that many would later call destiny. For tribes across the region, the war was not simply a struggle between European powers. It was a fight for homelands. The Haudenosaunee, Shawnee, Delaware, and others weighed each promise, each treaty, each threat. Some sided with the French, who treated them as allies. Others leaned toward the British, who promised protection but delivered settlers. Many shifted loyalties as necessity dictated, trying to survive the rising storm. The forest was still the morning Major George Washington first saw the breath of winter roll across the Allegheny foothills. The air held the metallic smell of frost, the quiet tension of a continent on the edge of war. Behind him, the long line of Virginia militiamen waited, shifting their weight in the cold, rifles clutched tightly, eyes narrowing at the endless sweep of pines that would carry sound for miles. Washington watched his men and wondered if any of them truly understood what was about to begin. How a small dispatch mission into the wilderness had transformed into the spark that would ignite a global conflict. The year was 1754. The ground, though frozen, carried the footprints of forces far older than the men who marched upon it. Tribes whose alliances had been shaped by centuries of survival, European armies fighting for empires oceans away, and lands so vast that no king had ever truly mapped them. Washington's orders were simple. Warn the French they were trespassing on British-claimed territory. But the forest did not care about claims or treaties. It held only the truth that the first shot, once fired, would echo far beyond these trees. The Virginian stepped forward through the snow, his boots crunching softly. The party of native scouts moved ahead, their silhouettes blending almost invisibly with the terrain. Among them was the half-king, Tanahurison, a Seneca leader who believed the French threatened the freedom of all tribes caught between two empires. His movements were precise, his face unreadable, but his eyes carried the weight of decisions forced upon him by men who wrote maps without understanding the land. It was Tanahurison who first sensed movement before dawn. When the mist clung low to the ground, he signaled sharply. Washington's men froze. The forest exhaled like a giant waking from sleep. Washington heard nothing, yet the half-king had already nocked an arrow and pointed toward a ravine veiled in shadow.